us. We're just getting started here, so we'll make sure that we've got everything in order. This webinar is being organized as part of the consultations on Canada's National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. The in-person consultation is coming up in just over a week, but we're glad to have these webinars as a way of getting started in the meantime. And you will excuse us a bit if we try to work out a few bumps as we go along. Monique, how do I share my screen? Can you tell me that? Can you whisper in my ear? Whoops.
Great. Hi.
Hi, can you tell me how I share the screen?
Yeah, go to the sharing tab.
Okay, just a sec here. Sharing tab.
In the first button to your left, it says there's a little arrow, and you can select My Screen.
Share my web screen. I see the webcam, the audio, and the chat.
Yeah, so if you click on the right of that, it says Sharing at the top.
Just share my webcam. Sorry, everyone. Apologies for this. I get a mic, I get a webcam, and I get view in window mode. You must have a different box than me. Can you put the PowerPoint up?
Here, just a sec. I'm going to send you a message, Beth.
Okay. In the meantime, let's get started. Since we have, I'm not sure how many people we have online, but welcome everyone. We're really glad to have you with us today. Today we're going to be exploring the national defense side of Canada's National Action Plan. And for those of you that are aware, the National Action Plan, the previous one, ran from 2010 to 2016. And the issues that were explicitly outlined in that National Action Plan for the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces, including training on a number of topics ranging from the differential impact of conflict on women, men, boys, and girls to HIV/AIDS, on the United Nations Security Council resolutions on women, peace, and security. It also included references to women's participation in decision-making and deployments for peace operations in Canada, involving Canadian personnel. There were actions related to the integration of a gender perspective into security policy and frameworks. There was also a reference to encourage other troop-contributing countries to address training and women in peace support operations. There was a mention of sexual exploitation and abuse by Canadians serving in peace support operations and urging the government to address these promptly. And finally, there were references to peace operations in general relating to Canadian participation and asking that these included measures to promote and protect the rights of women and girls and prevent and respond to sexual violence. So what we're looking to discuss today is what should the next CNAP include? And we're really fortunate to have with us two excellent researchers, academics who have done a lot of very, very interesting work on these topics. I'd like to introduce Maya Eichler from Mount St. Vincent University in Halifax, Maya is the Canada Research Chair in Social Innovation and Community Engagement, as well as an assistant professor in the Department of Political and Canadian Studies. And I'd also like to introduce Stéfanie von Hlatky, an assistant professor of Political Studies at Queen's University and the director of the Queen's Centre for International Defence and Policy. Stéfanie has also worked extensively with NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and she is the founder, co-founder, and current chair of the board of Women in International Security Canada. So welcome Maya, welcome Stéfanie.
Thank you so much for having us.
Great. Monique, do we have the PowerPoint up now? I'm not sure. We will proceed as if we do. I am so sorry for this, everyone.
I can see it, so if that helps. Yeah, this is Maya. I can see it.
Okay, super, super, super.
Excellent.
Great.
Just tell me when to switch the slide, Beth.
Okay, now we want to go to we want to go, you can show everyone the nice pictures of Stéfanie and Maya. There we go. And let's move on to the first question that we've, which is the next slide. Stéfanie, this question's for you. We've called this webinar More Than Counting Women in the Military because there's a lot of discussion that women, peace and security, the women, peace and security agenda does involve more than just increasing the number of women serving at different ranks in the military. What do you see as the key issues that the Department of National Defence and the Canadian Armed Forces should address if Canada is to contribute to achieving global women, peace and security goals?
Thank you, Beth. First of all, I think that counting women is important, to be sure. For a lot of us doing research on women, peace, and security, one of the challenges that we've faced in the past decade is getting reliable data on women's participation in the Canadian Armed Forces, especially when it comes to the number of women who are deployed on operations. So now you're seeing a shift in the last few years where that data is more systematically collected, and of course that's not only helping with benchmarking and with measuring progress at the national level, but it's also very useful then for the type of work that happens on the margins by researchers and civil society organizations that want to provide some much needed analysis. So even though the title of the event is called More Than Counting Women, I really think it's important not to lose sight of that because gender disaggregated data is fundamental. Beyond counting women, we have to consider the attempts at gender mainstreaming. And gender mainstreaming is a term that I think can lead to a lot of confusion, but essentially what is meant by the term gender mainstreaming is that you take gender into account in all activities related to conflict prevention, conflict management, conflict resolution, and if you're sitting in a national capital, you want to integrate gender perspectives as part of policy, operational planning, and missions as well. So it's really about equipping individuals, both on the civilian and military sides of the house, to be able to perform that analysis and to understand how to integrate those broader principles that are enshrined in United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 in their day-to-day tasks. So I really believe that's where the gap still is not only understanding the guidelines and broad principles, but understand how they matter for your own day-to-day work. And that means really tailoring a lot of those principles to specific tasks and working really at the ground level and not putting forward a broad approach that's a one-size-fits-all.
Great, that's really helpful, and I think that we're going to explore a little bit more what that means, because gender perspectives, as you say, gender mainstreaming can lead to a lot of confusion, and it's really important to be concrete as we move forward. And so this is something we're going to be looking at in the next few minutes. But Maya, if we can turn to you. Because one of the other big questions, we've heard a lot from the current government about feminist approaches We had just last week, once again, our Prime Minister talking about the importance of a feminist approach. Generally, he's often used it more in line with supporting business women or looking at other sectors. You've written about what a feminist approach to defense policy might mean. Can you elaborate a bit on your thinking on this?
Yes, thanks, Beth. I started thinking about a feminist defense policy for Canada in the context, of course, of Sweden's announcement of a feminist foreign policy in 2015, and then also in the context of our own domestic national defense policy review last year. And I participated in one of the roundtables, and I decided to title my submission Feminist Defense Policy for Canada, ? It was meant a little bit as a provocation to kind of push the government further. But let me just explain a little bit what my starting point was in thinking about the issue. So defense policy as we know it now really reflects the interests of the state and puts the security of the state at the forefront. And a feminist defense policy, I think, would have to shift our focus from state to human security, and in particular to women's security. But it would also have to include really taking seriously non-militarized forms of security, such as economic security, food security, and environmental security. So on the one hand, I think it would have to go beyond simply increasing the number of women in the defense sector, even though I agree with Stéfanie that that's important to do and it's important to keep track of that. But it would have to go beyond adding women and achieving gender balance, and it would have to even go beyond integrating a gender perspective and gender mainstreaming. So I think an explicit feminist defense policy would have to incorporate gender equality as one of its key objectives. And that is certainly not something we've seen in Canada yet, that kind of, putting gender equality at the forefront of defense policy. And I think more ambitiously, one of the things that a feminist defense policy would also have to recognize is that global gender inequalities negatively impact international peace and security. So it's not just about including gender equality as a goal and including a gender perspective, which looks at the different gender impact of conflict, but an approach that really recognizes that if we want to successfully address international peace and security issues, we need to take gender inequalities as root causes of conflict more seriously.
Okay, so that's you're issuing a big challenge to the National Action Plan, one that I think is quite consistent with some of the global thinking on from civil society on what the original roots of the women, peace and security involved. And we'll get a chance to maybe have a look at what that might be concretely. Monique, could we move the PowerPoint along, please? We've done that. Now, okay, so Stéfanie, back to you. You talked about how it would be important for people to take a gender perspective into account into their day-to-day work, that we have to understand what this means for people working in different areas. And certainly then training will be an important element of that. I know that you've done research on what makes for effective gender training for defense personnel. Could you elaborate a little bit on what that might involve? And can you comment on where the Canadian Armed Forces are currently in terms of gender training?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. So the research project that you're referring to is currently funded by the NATO Science for Peace and Security program. And so the training that I'm co-developing with my co-investigator, Dr. Heidi Hart at the University of California, Irvine, is really intended for a NATO community, but both civilians and military. And the approach that we've taken, and it's based on the research that we've done, is that to be able to integrate this kind of gender training, you really need to know the organization that you're dealing with inside out. So the first task that we set out was to do a comprehensive review of all of the policy documents, guidance documents, directives that NATO had produced on gender, and proceeding to coding these 102 documents over the first summer with a team of research assistants. And then by understanding how NATO works across its institutions already in terms of gender mainstreaming, you can find the relevant entry points for more tailored gender training. So for us, we needed to find the induction training or the security briefing or any other occasion where we can integrate a gender analysis as part of NATO's day-to-day tasks. We also felt that it was important to match that kind of gender analysis to scenarios that were relevant for NATO, its member states, and its partner states. And so when you start looking at some of the priority areas for NATO, doing that kind of training with specific scenarios in mind that are part of the day-to-day concerns of the NATO community, but the civilians and military staff working at the headquarters, for example, I think you're able to get a bit more buy-in in terms of the training, so it's not seen as a check-the-box exercise, but it's seen as something that can really help improve people's ability to do their work. In terms of the Canadian Armed Forces context more specifically, I think there's a lot that has been achieved in a short year after the CDS has issued certain directives. For instance, the Canadian Armed Forces were asked to take the GBA Plus training that was developed by Status of Women, and I think that's a very important first step. I think moving forward, it'll be important for those types of training packages to be further tailored to the experiences of the armed forces. And so one way to do that, for instance, is to perform the same type of organizational scoping study that, for instance, I've done with NATO and looking at some of those entry points for tailoring that training. A perfect example of this, in my view, would be to see how military exercises, for instance, can incorporate a gender dimension. So we're right in the period of Maple Resolve, which is our really large exercise that the Canadian Armed Forces do out in Wainwright. And so why wouldn't this be a good occasion to integrate a gender insert or a gender scenario for the Canadian Armed Forces to really practice with? So those are the types of practical examples I think that can really make a difference and really bring stakeholders to that aha moment. I understand how this works. It's not just macro principles, but I see now how it applies to my day-to-day work. Key to making that happen, of course, are the gender advisors that were selected last year. So the CDS has made sure that there would be gender advisors supporting various commands. So there's a gender advisor for the Special Operations Forces at CANSOFCOM. There is one at the Strategic Joint Staff, and there's also a gender advisor supporting the Canadian Joint Operations Command, or CJOC. So those gender experts then can find those entry points and can work with the relevant stakeholders to make sure that gender is not just something that you do when you're asked to provide a report, but that you do throughout the range of activities that you are tasked with performing.
Great. We're going to be talking a bit about the CDS directive, and just for people who may be a little bit new to some of the defense work, Stéfanie, can you just explain what CDS stands for?
Yes, it's the Chief of the Defense Staff, so he's the highest military officer in the Canadian Armed Forces.
Thanks. And also in terms of training, you mentioned the GBA Plus, and that's just to clarify, that's the gender-based analysis plus training that, as you mentioned, Status of Women has developed. That is a generic course that's being promoted across all of the Canadian Federal Service, and there's Status of Women Canada has significant amount of information online that people can check out if they're interested in that. I think it's really, really interesting how you've talked again about making this concrete and helping people improve how they do their work as a significant entry point on the way in. And some people would say that the Chief of Defense Staff's directive for integrating Security Council Resolution 1325 was a very important document. It was adopted last year, as you mentioned. Maya, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about this directive and what makes it so significant.
Sure. So this directive was signed in January 2016, and it's really significant because it explicitly states a commitment to applying a gender perspective to all Canadian Armed Forces planning and operations, and it does that in this single document, and that's really the first time that the Canadian Armed Forces has presented its commitment in this sort of very integrated and structured way. So I think it was very interesting for those of us watching these efforts over the years. The document, explicitly recognizes that women's and men's experiences in armed conflict differ, and that the same process might have differential outcomes on them. It also very clearly, reaffirms Canada's international commitments to gender mainstream its defense policy, both through the UN and NATO. And it also lays out some of the ways in which the Canadian Armed Forces plan to implement this gender perspective. So, for example, one of the things it mentions is that DND and the Canadian Armed Forces plan to meet twice a year with civil society groups to discuss progress on applying a gender perspective. One of the central terms that is used, that Stéfanie already brought up, is GBA+, Gender-Based Analysis Plus. And the way that it gets defined in this directive is as an analytical competency. So it is a competency that the goal is that everyone in the Canadian Armed Forces will eventually have. And so this is the means by which gender mainstreaming is going to be carried out. The focus is still, or I guess the way that it's sort of applied and justified, GBA Plus, is not only in terms of Canada's international and domestic commitments, but also as a way to improve operational effectiveness. And I think that is useful, but it's also problematic in other ways, so that maybe we can talk about later on. But it explicitly links GBA Plus to operational effectiveness. One of the important plan stated, and one that it has already been accomplished, is placing 3 gender advisors. One Stéfanie already mentioned, to the CDS, one to the Commander of Canadian Joint Operations Command, and to the Canadian Special Operations Command as well. Now, in terms of longer-term goals, the document also states that it plans to implement the requirements of the CNAP and GBA Plus into all Canadian Armed Forces planning and operations by August 31st, 2017. So this is a very ambitious goal. And also it plans to implement the requirements of CNAP and GBA Plus into the broader Canadian Armed Forces institution as a whole by March of 2019. So the goal would be that all Canadian Armed Forces members by that point have developed this competency in GBA Plus, which right now means doing that online status of women tutorial, but hopefully it can mean something more than that eventually. So I think it's a very ambitious and strong statement, but a lot will depend on how this training happens and what resources are going to be made available to support this initiative. I think that's always the big question for me, because I think there's a lot of good rhetoric and rhetorical commitment, but I guess for me the question is always, will the resources be there to support these initiatives? Yeah, so I'll just leave it at that. Beth?
Great, that's a great overview, and certainly we'll get back. I hope we have time to talk about the pros and cons of hinging the argument on an operational effectiveness focus. But certainly one of the things that many people in Canadian civil society have pushed for in terms of the new CNAP is that there be explicit resources allocated. The previous CNAP did not have a separate budget. Every department was expected to carry out the activities within their regular budget, and we often pushed for an accounting of what was being invested and how money was being spent, and that is something that we would like to see improved in the next CNAP. So I think thank you very much for raising that point as well. Was there anything in the directive in terms of reporting, public reporting on progress? Stéfanie,
well,
or Maya, yeah.
I mean, there's the meetings with civil society groups to discuss progress, though I don't know if any has taken place yet. Maybe Stéfanie knows. I'm not aware of any.
I'm not aware of any either.
Yeah, it would be interesting to follow
and certainly
up on that.
with our network, we did have planned twice yearly meetings with Global Affairs and all CNAP partners, but given we haven't had one in over a year, given all the discussions going on the international assistance review consultations, on the defense policy consultations, and then now waiting on the consultations around the CNAP. So it's been a bit of an unusual year in that regard. But certainly those you've raised a number of issues that we can follow up with. On with D&D representatives during the formal consultation. Stéfanie, another question for you. We haven't talked about peace support operations, but certainly this is likely to loom large in terms of how Canada allocates our defense resources in the next while. The government has said that it intends to recommit to UN peace support operations. We're still waiting on a specific announcement about the details of what mission. But I'm wondering if you could tell us if this mission becomes an important part of our defense policy, what would be some of the key areas that this kind of commitment should include in order to support women, peace, and security goals and issues?
Yes, that's a very important question. I think all of us are really eager to find out what will happen on the peace support operations side. I would tend to place a lot of emphasis on the importance of pre-deployment training and making sure that gender is a central part of that pre-deployment training. Right now, this type of training is offered, for instance, at the Peace Support Training Center here in Kingston, Ontario, where I am. And there are some key slides as part of this pre-deployment training that deal specifically with the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, but not so much in terms of what we've been talking about today, the more gender mainstreaming aspect. So from what I could see, a big emphasis on sexual and gender-based violence, but in the context of conflict, and less so when it comes to sexual violence perpetrated by peacekeepers themselves, and doesn't engage so much either with this narrative that UN Women is driving about the importance of having women at the table when peace is being negotiated, and the importance of having women as part of the peacekeeping force. And here again, I'll just state that this is the narrative that has been favored by the UN, creating this link between the presence of women and better operational outcomes, and then we can certainly debate the merits of that approach. As Maya Eichler has already mentioned, we can also critically engage with this idea, but that's the approach that the UN has put forth, stating that when you include women as negotiators at the peace table, you see a 20% increase in the probability of these agreements lasting at least 2 years. I mean, we've heard some of these numbers that the UN has been collecting to demonstrate this link between the presence of women and better operational outcomes. The other types of arguments that the UN has made is that when you have more female peacekeepers, either as uniformed personnel, both military and police, but also as civilians as part of those missions, you broaden the skill set. You introduce role models to local women and girls. Maybe female peacekeepers are more approachable, so it would be easier to interview survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. So those sets of different arguments that are put forth by the UN, I don't think are really grappled with when it comes to the type of pre-deployment training that is currently available for the Canadian Armed Forces. Something else that I think the Canadian Armed Forces need to focus on is that, even though Canada has been engaged in peace support operations, it's had less than 30 peacekeepers out there recently. So Canada will have to re-engage with what UN culture is, really to be able to understand how best to again integrate the gender perspective as part of new peacekeeping operations. And here I think there might be some merit for a center like the Peace Support Training Center, or for some of the individuals that will be tasked with a commanding role in operations, but to look at what other peace support training centers have done elsewhere in the world, whether it's Scandinavian partners or some of our more traditional allies, just to see some of the best practices that have been developed, to engage in a bit of benchmarking, because we're really going to see a scaling up of Canada's involvement. And so having 29 military personnel in the field is very different from several hundreds. And so how is that scaling up going to happen? And I think that Canada would benefit from re-engaging with other stakeholders elsewhere in the world to make sure that it's at the very cutting edge of best practices when it comes to peacekeeping in general, but also the integration of a gender perspective as part of peace support operations.
So do you think that there's lots we can learn from other forces around the world?
I certainly think that the Peace Support Training Center in Canada obviously hasn't been resourced to the same extent as other peace support centers elsewhere in the world that have played a much more active role in peace support operations. I'm thinking of the Swedes and the Norwegians in particular. And if they have managed to invest a lot more in terms of studies and reports to support the work of their deployed military personnel in peace support operations, then this is something that Canada needs to look at and to arm itself with data analysis, lessons learned, and good practices as it re-engages. Because even though Canada has the stated commitment to re-engage, let's be honest, the resources are still very limited. And with the Canadian Armed Forces stretched so thin, asking them to do a lot more with the same amount of resources will require relying on existing resources that may not be here in Canada, but may be elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. And that's interesting, because that's even an element that has been raised about the CDS directive and about looking at women, peace and security issues more generally in the armed forces, that once again we're asking an already stretched organization to take on extra tasks, do more training, and develop more skills, and that this can be very, very difficult if additional resources aren't provided to do that. So it's I think it's going to be an interesting challenge. We have one more question for Maya, and then I'd like to you could both think if there's anything that we've talked about so far that you'd like to respond to. But one other issue that I think it's really important that we include in this starting discussion of what, when we're looking at all the scope of issues that might be incorporated into the new National Action Plan, and you raised it, Stéfanie touched on it briefly, and that's the issue of sexual exploitation and abuse in the UN jargon, we talk a lot about sexual exploitation and abuse, or SEA, and we're usually referring to abuses by peacekeepers, that's civilian and military, as it relates to the local population in terms of abuse of power, exchanging sex for, or encouraging women, and we've seen sex for goods, but we've also seen in the last several years not just transactional sex, but we've seen horrific abuse of young boys and girls by peacekeepers under the UN flag. And some people have linked this to the work that's been done in the Canadian Forces in the last few years looking at inappropriate behaviors. And Maya, I know that you've looked a lot at the report that came out a couple of years ago called the Deschamps Report, and I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit about what that report involved and why it's important, and if there have been any progress on addressing those the recommendations in that report.
Yes, sure. So the Chief of Defense Staff ordered this external review into sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces in 2014, and this was in response to a lot of new media reports on sexual violence in the Canadian Armed Forces. And this external review was conducted by former Supreme Court Justice Marie Deschamps, and she released her report in April of 2015. And she spent several months traveling across the country, spoke to around 700 people in the military, and so based on her research and on these interviews and focus groups she conducted, she wrote this report. And in the report, she documents what she calls a sexualized culture within the Canadian Armed Forces. She argues that this culture is hostile towards female service members, but also lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender service members. In her own words, she found that there is a prevailing sexualized environment characterized by frequent use of sexualized language, sexual jokes, innuendos, discriminatory comments with respect to the abilities of female members of the military, and less serious but unwelcome sexual touching. So that was a quote from her report. And essentially what she is arguing is that this sexualized culture creates the grounds that enables more serious sexual assault to happen. Much of what she found was more recently confirmed by the release of a Statistics Canada survey in November of 2016. And that survey was very significant because it was the first external survey conducted on the issue in the Canadian military. And for those of you who haven't seen those results, they're maybe not surprising, but still, I think, indicative of a serious problem. So those survey results showed, for example, that 4 in 5 members saw, heard, or experienced inappropriate sexual or discriminatory behavior. It also found that sexual violence impacts both women and men, but that women are more likely to be the victims of sexual assault in the military. In fact, in the regular forces, 1 in 4 women responded to the survey saying that they had experienced assault during their service, and in the reserve force it was 1 in 3 women. In any case, in response to the release of the Deschamps report in April of 2015, the Chief of Defense Staff launched what it called Operation Honor. So this was an operation with the explicit goal of eliminating sexual harassment and assault in the Canadian military. And again, it linked it very much again to this issue of operational effectiveness that we've talked about already a little bit. So in Operation Honor, the argument is made that sexual harassment and assault has a negative impact on operational effectiveness, and that is one of the reasons why it needs to be eliminated. Now, I think, to me, Operation Honor is very significant because it is the first time in the history of the Canadian military that there is an explicit recognition that sexual assault and harassment is a systemic problem, and I think that is really a historic step that the military has publicly acknowledged that, and that is something we shouldn't underestimate. And what we have seen over the last year is the release of 2 progress reports. So there was a progress report released in August, in February of 2016 and August of 2016. And just to give you a few examples of what those progress reports found. So those progress reports are written basically in response to the 10 recommendations that Deschamps made in her report. And so to give you a couple of examples of what has happened, a sexual misconduct response center has been set up that is at arm's length from the military, so people can report experiences, or when they witness sexually inappropriate behavior, they can call that response center. It has been set up, but its final configuration will happen this coming summer. It's also been found that there's been an increase in reporting, which is positive. There's been more guidance given to training officers. There's an updating of curriculum that's happening, that's still underway. And there are also plans to create an advisory council with outside expertise on it. Now, I guess overall, I think it's a positive development. Some of my concerns are that there's no independent evaluation tools to assess and measure the progress that's happening with Operation Honor. I guess one of the measurements will be repeating the Stats Canada survey more regularly, though the military hasn't entirely committed to how often that's going to happen, but I'm hoping that that survey will be repeated every 2 to 3 years. And I guess I've been waiting for the most recent progress report. I haven't seen it. I was expecting it this past February because there's supposed to be 2 a year, so I haven't seen a recent one. So I think there's some concern over whether the process has stalled a little bit. Yeah, so maybe that's good for an initial overview. Beth, what do you think?
That's great. I think that's very helpful to give a sense of what were some of the issues and where some of the progress has been, and then and some of the concerns. Just as an aside to our all the people listening in, we have collected some questions that we're going to be turning to in a little bit from participants. But if something has occurred to you during Maya and Stéphanie's comments that you would like to ask, there is a questions tab that you can type in your questions, and we will try to squeeze in as many as we can in our remaining 15 plus minutes. I'm just wondering if we can pick up a little bit on points that both of you made around this question of operational effectiveness, because we know it is a two-edged sword. We often want to make the argument in favor of using a gender perspective, using gender analysis, because it will make us better at the jobs that we're already doing. But there also are some concerns with this. You raised this, Maya. Do you want to take a couple of minutes to explain what your concerns are?
So I think that, definitely the argument can be made that taking a gender perspective into consideration gives us a better understanding of a particular security context. So that's not what that's not the problem I have with it. So I think for sure it gives us a better understanding of what's going on the ground. It gives us a better understanding of the impact of that policy. But I guess my concern is with the almost what I would call an instrumental use of gender, right? This idea that it has instrumental value, I think maybe takes away a little bit from the intrinsic value that it has in terms of the goals that are important, right? And this goes back to what I was saying originally about a feminist defense policy, right? I mean, the question is really about whether our focus should be on more than operational effectiveness. and the Defense of Canada, should gender equality be a goal of defense policy? So I think that is something that we need to grapple with when we start talking about operational effectiveness and gender, because we're really not going as far as at least feminist scholars are urging us to go. And I guess the other, my other issue with operational effectiveness and the way that it's been used in particular in relation to the Deschamps report and questions of sexual violence in the military is that that instrumental approach doesn't go far enough in challenging the underlying, what I would call, masculinized warrior culture of the Canadian military. So in a sense, it's almost using that warrior culture, right, that idea of military ethos and operational effectiveness to address a problem that has at its roots some of those very ideas of masculinity. So in some ways, I'm not sure that we're moving ahead in really bringing about a solution to gender inequality and sexual violence in the military if we focus solely on operational effectiveness.
You've made a transition to a theme that came up in the questions that were submitted in advance of the webinar. And so, Stéfanie, I'm wondering if you want to try to tackle them, even though they are really, they're difficult. We've had one question that says, it would be great to hear from the panelists about the efforts needed or underway to change the culture of violent masculinities in the military. And another one, do current efforts of gender-based analysis for defense policy include a sensitive understanding of the issue's effects of militarized masculinity? I'm throwing that into your court. What do you have any perspectives on that?
Yes, and if I have time to, I'd also like to chime in on the previous question that was posed to Maya. But so from the work that I've done so far, I've noticed a bit of a concerning disconnect between the Canadian Armed Forces as an organization and activities that they perform that would be considered internal, and then their whole external range of activities, which happens in the context of missions. And I think that so far, when it comes to sexual and gender-based violence, there has been a real focus on that external realm, as I mentioned before, and the whole Deschamps file has been treated as really separate from anything else that the Canadian Armed Forces are doing on gender. And I can understand some of the organizational reasons for why this choice was taken, but I also think that when you were introducing training like GBA+, what you're really trying to do for your staff is to get them to have that broad-based awareness of how gender applies in all of the contexts, whether it's internal or external. So I'm a little concerned about that really clear-cut separation that we've seen so far, and the reluctance on the part of the Canadian Armed Forces when talking about gender to also open up the discussion to what they consider as a very separate file, which is the Deschamps report and the recommendations that followed. I also think there's maybe a bit too much risk aversion when it comes to engaging more deeply about the culture of the Canadian Armed Forces and ideas around militarized masculinities. Now, that doesn't mean it never happens, because I know a lot of committed instructors who are willing to grapple with these difficult concepts and how they have been impacting military culture. But I think that the risk aversion is due to the necessity in the short term of getting buy-in from the organization, right, for the post-Deschamps recommendations on the one hand, and perhaps for the gender file more broadly speaking, and the idea that they're going to use language and approaches that are going to be kind of tailored to the needs of the Canadian Armed Forces without upsetting the status quo too much. So I think what you see now is a bit of a compromise, where you see the adoption of some of the Deschamps report's recommendations, but at the same time where you see kind of this pragmatic realization that, if you want that broad-based organizational buy-in, you also have to propose a package or a number of steps that will be palatable to the members of the Canadian Armed Forces. So I think there's a balancing act that we have witnessed. And I think it's been kind of a conscious decision on a part of the kind of internal stakeholders. I also wanted to talk about what Maya mentioned when it comes to the link between gender and operational effectiveness. Where I'm concerned about it is that it puts all of the attention on the military. And when you're talking about defense and defense policy, well, there are a lot of civilians also who are developing policy approaches, who are taking part in the operational planning. And so I think that when you focus so explicitly on operational effectiveness, you tend to single out the military stakeholders. So on the civilian side, what types of training packages are available? How is gender integrated into the policy planning process at NDHQ? And sometimes I feel like that's one of the silences of this whole agenda, is that we tend to put so much emphasis on the military, and then we don't ask questions about the civilians doing defense and whether or not they're equipped to move this agenda forward.
Do you know now, is there particular training offered to the civilian side on gender mainstreaming or gender perspectives?
So I do know that there has been a GBA Plus expert hired in 2017 to assist the Strategic Joint Staff, and that they are going to roll out some training packages that are both for policy and then for operational planning and missions. So it's in the plans, though beyond the training, I think we have to look a bit more closely as well as in terms of the framing policy documents, whether or not gender is showing up in that core material.
It's really interesting because I think there's a lot that can be learned from non-military institutions on how they have grappled with some of these same challenges. And we've certainly learned in international development that you can train and retrain and even train again, but that doesn't necessarily lead to a change in behaviors or attitudes. And so I think some of the cautions that you're saying, you're expressing are very, very well, very, very apt, because we know that just having, even a 2-day training course is often not enough to move a whole organization along a spectrum of changed behavior. So that's really interesting. Maya, do you want to comment on the culture of masculinities? You
Sure.
mentioned it, but pick up a bit more on that.
Yeah, I think that's really one of the central questions, and it is the one that the military is probably least comfortable dealing with. So I appreciate the participants picking up on that issue, and I would hope that that question of masculinity can be brought up next week again in the meetings. So there's several problems I see, and I think one of the ways that masculinity is also important to highlight is because a lot of focus now is being put on increasing the number of women in the military, and and there's various reasons why the military is struggling with that, but I also sometimes wonder about whether that is the right question that we're asking, because we're putting a lot of onus on women to change the institution, right? So both when it comes to attempts at recruitment and also the way that Operation Honor has been laid out, there's a lot of focus on reporting and increasing reporting as a way to address sexual violence, rather than focusing on masculinity, understandings of masculinity, but also on all the men in the institution, right? So there's been not a lot of work done in that regard. I mean, the strategic response team did come out with a bystander training package last summer, and it was sent to divisions and units across the country, and they were asked to conduct this training. From what I know anecdotally, that training maybe happened, but it happened more in a let's check the box way than in a more thoughtful way that you would want it to happen. So I think that is something that could be worked on more, because that's about putting more of the onus on men in the organization as well to step up and to change things. And what else did I want to say? Yeah, maybe I'll just leave it at that for now because
Okay,
maybe there are more
well,
questions. But I think that, and I guess the last thing that I'll say, because there's so much emphasis on how can we recruit women and retain them, but I think we also the military needs to think more about the ways in which it appeals to men in its recruiting of men and how it trains its soldiers and how that training is still so intimately tied up with violent ideas of masculinity. So maybe I'll just leave it at that.
okay, very interesting. We have one last question from a participant today, and then unfortunately we'll have to move to wrap up, even though we've got many more issues we could explore. This participant writes, I wonder what the speaker's opinion would be if I suggested that until Operation Honor has had more time to address the documented issues of gender within the Canadian Armed Forces, that Canada may not yet be the best example of leadership overseas on this specific topic area. So the question is, should civil society be pushing? And so given all those challenges, should civil society be pushing to have more women in uniform and on peacekeeping operations before ensuring that these women, these Canadian women, have themselves safe workplaces to be doing this type of work? So it's a question that's come before, this question of responsibility is pushing for more the target 25% women in the CAF and increasing the number of women deployed overseas. Is that a responsible ask to have, given all these other concerns right now? So I'm going to toss this back to both Stéfanie and Maya, and if you want to tackle that question, or if there's something else that we've talked about that you'd like to address. You each have about 2 minutes to wrap things up. Stéfanie, do you want to go first, please?
Yes, I mean, I certainly understand where the question is coming from, and I think it's a really good question. At the same time, if we wait until National Armed Forces to be perfect to get them to do certain things, then we'll never get anything done. And so in the spirit of being a bit pragmatic in terms of my answer, I think it's really important to acknowledge what the gaps are and the failings. And as an organization, the Canadian Armed Forces has done some of that with the Deschamps report and by adopting various measures that would allow the Canadian Armed Forces to catch up, so to speak, because I definitely buy into the argument that even though Canada was one of the first nations to remove professional barriers for women in the military, after that it wasn't very active in terms of pushing other reforms forward. So you had this period of stagnation, and Maya and I have discussed this in the context of women in international security events, but where you saw a really a gender neutral ethos where a soldier was a soldier, it didn't matter if you were a woman or a man. Now the Canadian Armed Forces are grappling with that conception and engaging a bit more directly with more complex gender concepts, but there is still a bit of a gap between the Canadian Armed Forces and, let's say, other nations. I'm thinking of Scandinavian nations who have engaged with ideas of gender more comprehensively than the Canadian Armed Forces have done in the last 2 decades. So on the one hand, I agree with the premise of the question that Canada certainly is not a leader yet in terms of a lot of those guidelines, and perhaps is not the best example of leadership, but it certainly has the potential to be, and I don't want this to be the reason for why Canada doesn't engage on those issues. In fact, I think taking a leadership position is one of the surest ways to make sure that sustained attention will remain on this very important issue in the women, peace, and security agenda, more broadly speaking, if we're referring to peace support operations.
Right. So some challenges and some work yet to be done. Maya, the last word goes to you.
Yes, I think that's an excellent question. I absolutely also grapple with some of those ethical and moral questions about whether we should be pushing to have more women in international operations when our domestic institutions are still so lacking. So I think the important thing is to continuously address those tensions between you know, integrating a gender perspective into our domestic institutions and into international operations. And I agree that until Canada does not successfully integrate a gender perspective and sort of successfully address issues around sexual harassment and assault domestically, that it is not in a great position to do that internationally. That being said, I think that this effort is going to be ongoing. You know, I don't actually agree with Operation Honor in that sense that, you know, it will have this this final date where the goal will be achieved. I think this has got to be an ongoing attempt, and I think linking the domestic and international is useful because that way we can sort of also put international pressure on Canada to gender mainstream its domestic institutions. So I think the question is important to keep in mind, and I hope that people next week at the meetings keep bringing up the issue of the Deschamps report. I think that would be really, really important because it is actually central to our success in terms of gender mainstreaming our international operations.
Excellent. Thank you for the concrete advice for next week. And thank you both, Stéfanie and Maya. You have given us some background information. I think you've outlined the key issues that will have to be grappled with in looking at what will go into D&D, Canadian Armed Forces component of the National Action Plan, from the participation of women to training to the operational effectiveness, to how do you build these skills, what kinds of actions will be needed, to the whole issue of the Deschamps report and the culture within the military, what we can learn from others, and what it will take for Canada to be a leader on this important issue. So thank you so much for the informed and thoughtful contributions that you made today. I'd like to thank everyone for listening. We've gone a little bit over, but I'm saying because we had that lovely conversation at the beginning about how to make this thing work. We'll just take another minute to wrap up. That there's more documentation on the CNAP Consult website. We have links to some of the documents that we've mentioned today, including the CDS directive on the integration of 1325. In the Women, Peace and Security brief to the Defense Policy Review, there's also links to the Deschamps report and some of the background information. And we've also got links there to the submissions that both Stéfanie and Maya made to the Defense Policy consultation last year. On other themes, don't forget to sign up for the other webinars. We have one on Wednesday looking at refugees and women, peace and security, and then one the day right before 2 days before the consultations, looking at this whole discussion of feminist foreign policy, which should be very interesting as well. We have a survey on the website that we encourage you to go to and complete. And we just look forward to the ideas and discussions and in making the next National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security as concrete, useful, and effective as possible. So thank you again, Maya and Stéfanie, for your inputs into helping us build a strong discussion. And thanks to Monique for getting us all organized today.
Thanks so much, Beth.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Monique.
Thanks, everyone.